He was supposed to be just a pilot, successful, but never powerful enough to challenge the elite. But when a wealthy family tried to destroy him, they had no idea. They were creating their worst nightmare: betrayal, revenge, and a game of power where the real fight isn't about money but who controls the rules. This isn't just a story of survival. This is the rise of a man they never saw coming. The hum of the jet engines had always been a comforting sound to Nathaniel Nate Holloway. It was predictable, steady, unlike the world outside the cockpit, where people judged him before they even knew his name. At 34, Nate had spent more than a decade proving himself in an industry where few black men made it to the captain's chair. Now he was one of the best-paid pilots for an international airline, flying across continents, earning more than most of the executives who occasionally treated him like the hired help. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about altitude or flight pass. His mind was on Lauren. She was different from the women he had dated before: smart, ambitious, kind. A corporate lawyer in Manhattan, she carried herself with quiet confidence, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. They had met on a flight to San Francisco when she was traveling for work, and by the time they landed, there was an undeniable connection. 3 months later, here he was, about to meet her family in Greenwich, Connecticut. Nate had been around enough to know what he was walking into. The Whitmores were old money, the kind that came with country clubs, legacy admissions, and a carefully curated circle of acceptable acquaintances. He wasn't naive. He knew that in their world, a black man, no matter how successful, would always be seen as an outsider. Still, Lauren had insisted that they'd like him once they got to know him. He wanted to believe that, but he wasn't sure if he did. The sound of his phone buzzing pulled him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Elliot Ford, his closest friend and fellow pilot. "Man, tell me you're not really going through with this." Elliot's voice came through, laced with concern. Nate sighed, leaning back in his leather chair. "It's dinner, not a firing squad." Elliot snorted. "You ever seen a lion invite a zebra over for a meal?" "Same idea." Nate chuckled despite himself. "It's not that bad." "Oh, so they're rolling out the red carpet for you? Inviting you into the family?" Elliot paused, then his voice softened. "Look, I get it. You care about this girl, but rich white families like hers, they don't see us the way they see their own." Nate exhaled slowly. "I know what I'm walking into, but I'm not backing down just because they might look at me sideways." There was a beat of silence before Elliot spoke again. "Just keep your guard up, all right? You don't owe them a damn thing." After hanging up, Nate sat in the quiet of his apartment, the city lights of Manhattan sprawling out before him through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Elliot wasn't wrong. He had spent his whole life navigating spaces that weren't built for him, proving himself over and over again. But this wasn't about proving anything. This was about Lauren. At least that's what he told himself. Nate had flown into dozens of cities, landed in some of the world's busiest airports, and handled turbulence that would make most passengers hold their breath. But as he drove through the winding streets of Greenwich, Connecticut, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: unease. The Whitmore estate sat on a sprawling property lined with ancient oak trees, the kind of place that whispered old money without ever having to say a word. The driveway alone was longer than some of the runways he had taken off from. Nate pulled up to the entrance, his sleek black Audi a stark contrast to the Bentley and Range Rover parked beside it. Lauren had insisted on driving separately, saying she needed to help her mother prepare for dinner. That was the first red flag. She hadn't wanted to show up together. As soon as he stepped out, the evening air carried the crisp scent of manicured grass and the faintest hint of cigar smoke. The front doors swung open before he had a chance to knock. A tall, broad-shouldered man leaned against the doorframe. Carter Whitmore, Lauren's older brother. "Didn't think you'd actually show," Carter said, his voice carrying a smirk even before his face did. Nate met his gaze evenly. "Neither did I." Carter huffed a laugh, stepping aside just enough to let Nate through. The house was exactly what he had expected: polished marble floors, grand chandeliers, art that probably belonged in a museum. But it wasn't the wealth that caught his attention. It was the silence. The kind of silence that settled over a room when an outsider walked in. Lauren appeared from the hallway, a relieved smile on her face. "Hey, you made it." "Would have been hard to miss the place," Nate said, keeping his voice light. She took his hand, but the way her fingers barely curled around his felt different than usual. More careful, as if she was aware of every set of eyes in the room. "Come on, let's introduce you." They entered the grand dining room, where Reginald Whitmore, Lauren's father, sat at the head of an obscenely long table. His presence dominated the space without him having to say a word. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly combed back, his suit crisp despite the casual setting. Beside him, Victoria Whitmore, Lauren's mother, sat poised with a glass of wine, her expression unreadable. Reginald didn't stand when Nate approached. He simply studied him with a slow, deliberate glance, as if assessing the worth of a new stock option. "Nathaniel, is it?" His voice was smooth, practiced. "Lauren's told us quite a bit about you." "Good things, I hope," Nate replied, keeping his tone even. Reginald smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "We'll see." Carter, now leaning against the sideboard, chimed in. "So, you fly planes, huh? I guess that's exciting." "It is," Nate said, refusing to rise to the bait. "Pays well, too." Victoria finally spoke, swirling her wine. "I imagine it does, though I suppose it's not the same as owning an airline." Lauren's grip on his hand tightened slightly. "It's a different game," Nate agreed, his smile unwavering. "But I like playing in the one I'm in." Reginald leaned forward slightly, steepling his fingers. "Tell me, Nathaniel, what's your long-term plan? Surely a man like you isn't content just flying other people around forever." The words were wrapped in politeness, but the implication was clear. "You're successful, but not enough. Not for us." Nate exhaled slowly through his nose. This was going to be a long night. The scent of roasted lamb and aged wine filled the grand dining room, but to Nate the air was thick with something else. Expectation. He had been in high-stakes meetings before, handled negotiations with difficult clients, and managed emergency landings in chaotic conditions. But sitting at the Whitmore family's dining table felt like walking into turbulence he couldn't control. Lauren sat beside him, but the warmth he was used to in her presence felt diluted, as if she were caught between two worlds, one where she loved him, and another where she still sought her family's approval. Reginald Whitmore, ever the commanding presence, sliced his lamb with calculated ease before glancing at Nate. "So, Nathaniel, you fly commercial, correct? International routes?" "That's right," Nate replied, reaching for his glass of water. "Mostly transatlantic flights." Reginald nodded slowly, like he was processing some great revelation. "I suppose it's a stable profession. Though forgive me, I've always been curious. Do pilots have retirement plans? Or do they just fly until their reflexes give out?" Nate let out a slow breath. "So that's how it was going to be. It's a well-structured career," he said smoothly. "Great benefits, strong pension plan. And of course, there's always investing. Real estate, stocks, private ventures." Reginald raised a brow. "Private ventures? Interesting." Carter leaned forward, smirking. "Investing in what exactly? Stocks? Tech startups? Or are we talking about buying up rental properties in, uh, less desirable neighborhoods?" Nate met his gaze, unfazed. "A mix of things. A few stakes in up-and-coming aviation tech firms. Real estate across a few states." He took a sip of his water before adding, "The kind that keeps appreciating." Victoria, who had remained mostly quiet, gave a practiced smile. "That's impressive. But tell me, Nathaniel, do you ever think about the kind of circles you move in, the people you work with, the investors you associate with? Do you find it welcoming?" There it was, the polished, polite version of a question he had heard in 100 different ways before. "Do you fit in?" Nate set his glass down with careful precision. "Success has a way of making people forget their biases. At a certain level, all they see is numbers." Reginald let out a quiet chuckle. "Ah, but power isn't just about numbers, is it?" "No," Nate agreed, holding his gaze. "It's about who controls them." There was a flicker of something in Reginald's expression, surprise, maybe even amusement. Carter, however, didn't seem satisfied. He swirled his wine before saying, "So tell me, Nate, what's your endgame?" Because let's be real, most guys would ride the salary of a pilot and call it a day. You, though, you talk like someone who wants more. Lauren tensed beside him, but Nate remained steady. I don't believe in ceilings, he said simply. Every career, every industry, it's just a stepping stone to something bigger. If you stop pushing, you start settling. Carter scoffed. That's cute. But at the end of the day, some people are meant to lead, and some are meant to take orders. No shame in that. It's just how the world works. The insult was subtle, but not enough to be missed. Know your place. Nate smiled, slow and deliberate. You're right about one thing. Some people are born into leadership. Others have to take it for themselves. The room went quiet for just a beat too long. Reginald studied him. Victoria's expression remained unreadable. And Carter's smirk had vanished. Lauren cleared her throat, forcing a bright smile. So, Nate, remember that trip we took to Napa? Tell them about that wine tour you love so much. It was a blatant attempt to shift the conversation, to smooth the edges before they cut too deep. But Nate knew. This wasn't just dinner. It was a test. And something told him it wasn't over yet. The dining room had settled into an uneasy rhythm, forced politeness, shallow conversation, and an underlying tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Nate had seen this tactic before. Reginald, Victoria, and Carter weren't just engaging in small talk. They were probing, analyzing, searching for weaknesses. But Nate didn't break easily. As the meal wound down, Reginald set his napkin aside, tapping his fingers lightly against the table. Nathaniel, we're having a small gathering at the Greenwich Club this weekend. It's a private event. Just a few key people from finance, real estate, politics, the kind of crowd that shapes the future of this country. Nate recognized the bait immediately. Reginald continued, Lauren tells me you have a keen interest in business. Perhaps you'd like to join us, get a sense of how these circles operate. Carter chuckled under his breath, swirling the last of his wine. Yeah, you should come. See how the real power players move. Lauren shot her brother a sharp look, but Nate only smiled, his expression unreadable. Sounds like an interesting evening, he said, leaning back slightly. I'd be happy to join. Reginald nodded, satisfied. Good, I'll have someone send you the details. Victoria took a final sip of her wine before placing her glass down with a delicate clink. It's important to surround yourself with the right people, Nathaniel. Success isn't just about what you know, it's about who you know. Nate tilted his head slightly, his voice smooth. That's true, but I've also found that the right people tend to reveal themselves when tested. There was a pause, brief but noticeable. Reginald's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, like he'd picked up on the unspoken challenge. Carter, on the other hand, looked less amused. Well, let's hope you're as impressive in a room full of real decision-makers as you are in a cockpit. Lauren exhaled quietly, setting her fork down. All right, I think that's enough for one night. She turned to Nate, forcing a smile. Ready to head out? He could tell she was uncomfortable, eager to get away from the tension building between him and her family. He wasn't sure if she was embarrassed for them or for him. Still, he nodded, standing up and adjusting his jacket. As he extended a polite hand to Reginald, the older man took it firmly, his grip just tight enough to imply authority. I look forward to seeing how you carry yourself this weekend. Nate met his gaze steadily. Likewise. Outside, the night air was cool against his skin, a stark contrast to the weight that had settled in his chest. As he walked Lauren to her car, she let out a slow breath, rubbing her temples. I'm sorry, she murmured. I didn't think they'd be like that. He glanced at her, searching for any real frustration, any sign that she had fought back against their condescension, that she had been on his side, but she looked more weary than angry. I expected it, he said simply. She hesitated, then took his hand. They'll come around. You'll see. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced back at the house, where behind those grand windows he knew Reginald and Carter were already discussing him like a potential investment, assessing risk, measuring value. The problem was, they were underestimating him. And if there was one thing Nate had learned in life, it was that people who underestimated him always regretted it. The Greenwich Club was the kind of place where power wasn't flaunted. It was assumed. It existed in the way men carried themselves, in the low murmur of conversations that determined the future of markets and industries. This wasn't a place for dreamers or idealists. It was a place for those who had already won. Nate knew that the moment he stepped inside, the grand chandelier cast a warm glow over the mahogany-paneled walls, and the air smelled of old money, leather, aged scotch, and quiet arrogance. Men in tailored suits exchanged handshakes, their laughter just a little too measured, their smiles carefully restrained. Carter Whitmore spotted him first. "Well, well, look who decided to show up." He smirked, nursing a glass of bourbon. "I half expected you to back out." Nate adjusted his cufflinks, his expression unreadable. "Why would I do that?" Carter shrugged. "Some people don't handle pressure well." Nate chuckled. "Good thing I fly 200-ton machines at 35,000 feet for a living." Carter's smirk faltered for just a second before he gestured toward the bar. "Come on, let's introduce you to a few people." As they walked through the room, Nate felt the weight of more than a few stares. Some were curious, some skeptical, and a few downright dismissive. He recognized the game immediately. This wasn't about welcoming him. It was about watching him, seeing if he belonged. Reginald was already deep in conversation with two older men when he noticed Nate. With the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades navigating these rooms, he gestured him over. "Nathaniel," he said smoothly, "I was just telling Charles and Henry about you. Gentlemen, meet Captain Holloway, flies for one of the top international airlines." Nate shook hands firmly with both men, their grips brief but assessing. Henry, a silver-haired investment banker, raised an eyebrow. "A pilot, huh? That's interesting. Don't see many of your kind in this line of work." Nate smiled coolly. "Which kind is that?" Henry waved a hand dismissively. "People who transition into business from aviation. But then again, I assume you're more than just a pilot if Reginald's bringing you around." Reginald leaned back in his chair, his gaze sharp. "Nathaniel has an interest in investments. He's made a few plays in real estate and tech." Charles, the other man, nodded approvingly. "Smart move, long-term stability. But tell me, Nathaniel, what's your angle? Are you looking to grow your portfolio, or are you aiming for something bigger?" Carter chuckled under his breath, swirling his drink. "That's the question, isn't it?" Nate met their stares without hesitation. "I never think small. If there's an opportunity, I take it. But I don't invest just for the sake of it. I make sure it benefits me in the long run." Reginald tapped his glass lightly. "Interesting philosophy. So tell me, Nathaniel, what would you say is your biggest strength?" There it was, the real test. Nate let the silence linger for just a moment before he answered. "Adaptability." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Not ambition? Not drive?" Nate shook his head. "Those are important, but they don't mean much if you can't adjust when the rules of the game change. The people who survive, who win, aren't just the smartest or the most aggressive. They're the ones who know how to move when the ground shifts beneath them." Reginald studied him for a beat longer than necessary, then finally smiled. "I like that," he said. "It shows foresight." Carter, however, didn't look as impressed. He drained the last of his bourbon before leaning in slightly. "That's all well and good, but talk is cheap. Anyone can say they adapt. But when you're in a room full of sharks, you either prove you belong or you get eaten." Nate's lips curled into a slight smirk. "Then I guess we'll find out which one I am." Reginald let out a quiet chuckle. "I suppose we will." The night continued, the conversation shifting between finance, politics, and the unspoken power dynamics that ruled them both. But Nate knew one thing. This was only the beginning. They weren't just testing him. They were waiting for him to fail. The evening at the Greenwich Club had been a performance, a game of calculated moves where every handshake, every question, and every lingering glance had been a test. But Nate had walked away unscathed. Or so he thought. The next morning he woke to the sharp buzz of his phone vibrating on the nightstand. He groaned, rubbing his eyes before glancing at the screen. Elliot. Something in his gut told him this wasn't just a casual call. "Nate, you need to check the news." Elliot's voice came through, tight with urgency. Nate sat up instantly. What's going on? Someone's coming for you. Nate didn't need further explanation. He opened his laptop, fingers moving swiftly as he navigated to one of the major financial news sites. And there it was. The truth about Nathaniel Holloway, the pilot with more than just skies on his mind. The article was a hit piece, carefully crafted to raise doubt without outright accusations. It painted him as an over-ambitious opportunist, a pilot who played at being an investor, making reckless financial moves, associating with questionable figures. And the worst part? It was just vague enough to sound believable. He clenched his jaw as he scanned the paragraphs. They had included details about his stock investments, his real estate holdings, and, most concerningly, his relationship with Lauren. Sources say Holloway has been making moves in high society, particularly through his connection with the Whitmore family. One has to wonder, what does an airline pilot have to offer in these circles? Nate exhaled sharply, his pulse steady but his mind racing. This wasn't just a smear campaign, it was a warning. Elliot's voice cut through his thoughts. You know who did this, right? Nate didn't hesitate. Carter. Damn right. And he didn't do it alone. Someone fed that journalist the details. Nate's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what this was. Carter had lost the first round at the Greenwich Club, so now he was playing dirty. A second call buzzed in. Lauren. For a moment, Nate considered ignoring it, but he knew that would only make things worse. He answered, Hey, did you see it? Her voice was filled with tension. I saw it. She hesitated. I had no idea this was happening. I swear I would have stopped it if I... Nate cut in. It was Carter, Lauren, and maybe your father too. I don't know that. Nate let out a slow breath, pinching the bridge of his nose. Don't you? Silence. Then finally she said, I'll talk to them. Nate almost laughed, as if a conversation was going to change anything. Lauren, he said carefully, this wasn't an accident. They don't want me around, and they just made that clear to everyone. I don't care what they want. But the problem was, Nate wasn't sure if he believed that. She sighed. Just let me handle it, okay? I'll call you later. Nate didn't argue. There was no point. As he ended the call, he leaned back in his chair, staring at the article still glowing on his laptop screen. Carter thought this would make him back down. Make him walk away. He was wrong. If the Whitmores wanted a fight, they had just gotten one. Nate wasn't the kind of man who let an attack go unanswered. He had spent his entire life proving people wrong, proving that their assumptions, their prejudices, their quiet dismissals meant nothing. This wouldn't be any different. He picked up his phone and dialed. Elliot answered on the second ring. Tell me you're not just sitting there taking this. Nate exhaled sharply. Of course not. I need a name. Elliot was already ahead of him. The article was written by a guy named Richard Langston. Business journalist, but not the kind who breaks real stories. More like the type who gets tips from the right people and spins them into something damaging. Nate narrowed his eyes. And who's his usual source? There was a pause before Elliot answered. Frederick Langley. That name landed like a punch to the gut. Frederick Langley wasn't just another rich investor. He was a kingmaker, a man who had built and destroyed fortunes in equal measure. If Langley had his hands in this, then Carter and Reginald weren't acting alone. They were playing a game much bigger than Nate had realized. Elliot continued, Langley funds a lot of these financial news sites. He doesn't need to get his hands dirty. He just pulls the right strings. If he's involved, that means they're trying to do more than just embarrass you. They're trying to cut me off before I become a threat, Nate muttered. Bingo. Nate's mind raced. He needed to move carefully. If Langley was protecting the Whitmores, then that meant Langley had something to lose. And that was leverage. Can you get me Langley's recent investments? Nate asked. Elliot let out a low whistle. You're really going after this guy? You think I came this far to walk away? There was a beat of silence before Elliot chuckled. Man, I love when you get like this. All right, give me a few hours. As soon as he hung up, Nate's phone buzzed again. Lauren. He debated ignoring it, but picked up anyway. Nate, she started, her voice quiet. I talked to Carter. And? He swears he had nothing to do with the article. Nate let out a slow breath, keeping his voice steady. And you believe him? She hesitated. I don't know. My father? He wasn't surprised when I brought it up. Of course he wasn't. Nate, I don't want this to come between us. He pinched the bridge of his nose, his patience thinning. Lauren, this isn't just about us. Your family is trying to take me down, and now I have to deal with Langley in the mix. She inhaled sharply. Langley? Yeah. So unless you're going to tell me your father isn't in business with him, I need you to be honest with yourself about what's really going on here. Silence. Then finally she said, Be careful, Nate. I always am. As he hung up, he leaned back in his chair, staring out at the New York skyline. They wanted a war. Now they were going to get one. Nate spent years mastering control of a cockpit, of his career, of the way people perceived him. But this was a whole different kind of turbulence. The Whitmores had played their hand, and now with Frederick Langley in the mix, it was clear. This wasn't just about getting rid of him. It was about making sure he never even had a seat at the table. But if they thought he was going to just sit back and take it, they had underestimated him. Elliot came through faster than expected. The moment Nate picked up the call, his friend's voice was sharp and direct. I got what you need. Langley's been making some aggressive plays in commercial real estate. His company's been buying up properties through shell corporations, mostly undervalued assets in struggling markets. But here's the interesting part. Some of those acquisitions, they're tied to Whitmore real estate. Nate's grip tightened on his phone. So Langley isn't just helping them, he's using them. Bingo, Elliot confirmed. Looks like Reginald needed a lifeline after some bad investments, and Langley swooped in. But here's the thing. If the public knew how deeply Langley was entangled in these deals, especially using shady holding companies, it could raise some real red flags. With the SEC. Nate's mind raced. If Langley was using the Whitmores as pawns, then that meant there was an angle, something he could exploit. He glanced at the clock. He had a few hours before he was scheduled to meet Lauren for dinner. Time to make his first move. A strategic encounter. Nate arrived at a quiet upscale bar in the financial district, one of those places where deals were made over whiskey and whispered conversations. He wasn't here by accident. He knew Langley's people frequented this place, and he needed someone on the inside. After ordering a drink, he spotted his target, Jonathan Reese, a mid-level investment strategist who had worked under Langley for years. He wasn't important enough to be untouchable, but he knew enough to be useful. Nate took his glass and walked over. Mind if I join you? Reese looked up, clearly caught off guard, but he forced a smile. Captain Holloway, right? I read about you. Nate sat down, setting his drink on the table. Then you probably know I'm not someone who likes being played with. Reese tensed slightly but kept his composure. Look, I don't have anything to do with Langston's article. Nate smirked. You say that like you're not still taking a paycheck from a man who does. Reese exhaled, swirling the bourbon in his glass. What do you want? I want to know why Langley cares so much about me. Because from where I'm sitting, I'm just a pilot, right? Reese chuckled, shaking his head. That's where you're wrong. Langley doesn't care about you. He cares about control. And right now, you're a variable he didn't account for. Nate leaned in slightly. Then tell me something useful. Reese hesitated, but then he said something that changed everything. There's a reason Langley's backing the Whitmores. He's not just protecting them, he's positioning himself to take over. Nate's pulse ticked up. You're saying he's setting them up for a fall? Reese nodded. Reginald thinks Langley is his ally, but the second Whitmore real estate becomes more of a liability than an asset, Langley's going to pull the rug out. He'll buy them out for pennies, absorb the assets, and leave them in ruins. Nate let out a slow breath. So that was the game. Langley didn't just want to remove him. He wanted the Whitmores weak enough to take everything from them. And if Nate played this right, he could use that against them all. He downed the rest of his drink and stood. Thanks for your time. Reese watched him carefully. Whatever you're planning, be careful. Langley doesn't lose. Nate smirked. Neither do I. The shift. By the time he met Lauren for dinner, his mind was already 3 steps ahead. He greeted her with a kiss, but she was studying him, her expression cautious. You seem Calm, she noted. Nate picked up his menu. Should I not be? She sighed. My father asked about you today. Did he? He wanted to know if you were going to be a problem. Nate raised an eyebrow, finally meeting her gaze. And what did you tell him? She hesitated. That he doesn't know who he's dealing with. A slow smile pulled at Nate's lips. For once, we agree. Lauren shook her head, but there was something like admiration in her eyes. What are you planning? He leaned back in his chair, completely at ease. I'm going to show them what happens when they bet against the wrong man. Nate had spent his entire life navigating spaces where he wasn't supposed to belong. But this time, he wasn't just trying to fit in. He was here to take control. With the new information about Langley's plan to gut the Whitmores from the inside, Nate saw the opportunity to strike. If Reginald thought he was in control, he was about to learn otherwise. A bold move. The next morning, Nate sat in the sleek, glass-walled office of one of his real estate attorneys in Manhattan, scrolling through documents that Elliot had secured overnight. These are the properties Langley has been acquiring, Elliot said, tapping the tablet screen. But here's the interesting part. 3 of these buildings? They were supposed to be Whitmore assets. Nate leaned forward, scanning the files. Meaning Langley is already pulling the strings. Exactly, Elliot confirmed. Reginald thinks he still has leverage, but Langley is already squeezing him out. A slow smirk played on Nate's lips. Perfect, he turned to the attorney. How fast can I move on these? The lawyer, an older man with shrewd eyes, rubbed his chin. If you're serious, you can put in offers through a third-party entity today. If Langley doesn't see it coming, you might just get to those properties before he consolidates them. Nate nodded. Do it. This wasn't just about investments. It was about making Langley and the Whitmores realize that the man they were trying to push out was already ahead of them. A dangerous game. Later that evening, Nate arrived at an exclusive charity gala in the heart of Greenwich, the kind of event where business deals happened over champagne and forced smiles. He had barely stepped inside when Carter Whitmore appeared at his side, his expression laced with smug amusement. You've got nerve showing up here, Carter mused, swirling his drink. After everything that's happened, I would have thought you cut your losses. Nate smirked, his voice smooth. That's the thing about me, Carter. I don't believe in losses. Carter scoffed, but before he could respond, Reginald Whitmore appeared, his presence casting a heavy weight over the conversation. Nathaniel, Reginald greeted, his voice calm but edged. I see you've decided to remain in the game. Nate met his gaze without flinching. Did you think I'd fold? Reginald studied him for a long moment, then motioned toward a quieter corner of the venue. Let's talk. Carter, looking like he wanted to protest, was silenced by a sharp glance from his father. The power shift. The 2 men stood near the balcony overlooking the city, glasses in hand but untouched. Reginald took a measured breath before speaking. You're making moves. I know about the properties you're trying to acquire. Nate tilted his head slightly. Then you also know I'm only getting started. A flicker of something crossed Reginald's face. Irritation, maybe even respect. Langley doesn't take well to being challenged. Neither do I. Nate chuckled, shaking his head. That's the difference between us. You think I'm challenging you. I'm not. He stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough. I'm replacing you. Reginald's jaw tensed, his grip tightening around his glass. Careful, son. You don't know the kind of war you're inviting. Nate took a slow sip of his drink, his confidence unshaken. No, Reginald, you don't. Because by the time this was over, the Whitmores wouldn't just lose. They wouldn't even see the fall coming. Power wasn't taken in a single move. It was chipped away, piece by piece, until the old guard realized too late that they had lost control. And tonight, Nate was making his next cut. A silent threat. After his tense conversation with Reginald, Nate didn't linger at the gala. He had already made his point. The Whitmores now knew he wasn't backing down. Instead, he took a quiet drive back to Manhattan, his mind racing with the next step. Langley had been careful for years, but everyone had weak spots. And if there was one thing Nate had learned, it was that the bigger the empire, the more cracks it had beneath the surface. Elliot's call came just as he was pulling into his apartment's private garage. Langley's people are scrambling, Elliot said, his tone smug. He caught wind of your property buys and, let's just say, he's not happy. Nate smirked. Good. You sure about this, man? Elliot asked. You're poking a bear that swallowed bigger men than you. Yeah? Nate stepped out of the car, shutting the door behind him. Well, let's see if this bear knows what to do when it gets hunted. A meeting with the enemy. 2 days later, Nate received an invitation. A private lunch. Just him and Frederick Langley. It was rare for Langley to meet with anyone directly. The man operated in shadows, letting others do his bidding. So the fact that he wanted a face-to-face meant one thing. Nate had gotten under his skin. The restaurant was old-school wealth. No reservations, no menu. Just whatever the chef deemed worthy of serving that day. Nate walked in, calm and composed, as if he had been dining here his whole life. Langley was already seated, a whiskey in hand, watching him approach with the kind of detached amusement that came from knowing you had ruined men with a single phone call. Nate took his seat, matching the older man's gaze without hesitation. Langley studied him for a moment before speaking. You've been busy. Nate smiled. I like to keep things interesting. A slow smirk tugged at Langley's lips. That article, that wasn't personal, just business. But now you're making it personal. Nate leaned back, his expression unbothered. Funny. I thought I was just investing in a few properties. Langley chuckled, shaking his head. You think you're in control, but let me tell you something, son. This world, it doesn't belong to men like you. You might be talented, ambitious. Hell, you might even be rich. But power? He took a slow sip of his drink. Power is inherited. It's not something you just take. Nate exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. See? That's where you and I differ. You think power is a birthright. I know it's a game. And right now, he leaned in slightly. I'm playing better than you. Langley's smirk faded. Good. Let him feel it. After a pause, Langley set his drink down. You're making a mistake. Nate cocked his head. How so? Langley's voice was quieter now, but sharper. Because if you keep pushing, you won't just lose investments. You'll lose everything. A direct threat. Finally, honesty. Nate let the silence stretch between them before replying, voice even. Then I guess we'll see which one of us survives the fall. Langley watched him for another moment, then gave a slow, knowing smile. So be it. The war had officially begun. Nate had always believed that battles weren't won in public. They were decided in quiet meetings, backroom deals, and the spaces where power shifted without anyone realizing it. But this time, the war was spilling into the open. The first blow lands. 2 days after his meeting with Langley, Nate woke up to another headline. Nathaniel Holloway under investigation for insider trading? His stomach tightened, but his face remained unreadable as he read through the article. They were getting desperate. The piece was a mess of speculation, unnamed sources, and carefully worded accusations, suggesting that Nate's recent real estate acquisitions had been based on privileged information. Bullshit, but dangerous bullshit. His phone buzzed. Elliot. You see this? Elliot's voice was sharp. Yeah. They're not playing around, man. They filed a formal request for an SEC review. Nate exhaled slowly. Langley was done with subtle warnings. He was trying to bury him. Let them review, Nate said calmly. I have nothing to hide. Elliot scoffed. That doesn't mean a damn thing. They don't need evidence. They just need noise. Enough to make people doubt you. Nate clenched his jaw. He knew how this worked. It wasn't about truth. It was about perception. A fracture in the foundation. Later that evening, as Nate was strategizing his next move, his phone rang again. Lauren. He hesitated before answering. I just got off the phone with my father, she said, her voice uneasy. He says he had nothing to do with this. Nate rubbed his temples. And you believe him? Silence, then finally, I don't know. Nate's jaw tightened. She was still caught in the middle. Lauren sighed. Nate, this is getting out of control. My family, Langley, they don't lose. And if you keep pushing, he cut her off. You want me to stop? No, she said quickly. I just, I don't want you to get destroyed. Nate let the silence stretch between them before speaking. I know what I'm doing, Lauren. Do you? She whispered. For the first time, he wasn't sure how to answer that. A new play, Nate had always been good at spotting weaknesses, and right now Langley had one. The real estate acquisitions Langley had been using the Whitmores for? They weren't as airtight as he thought. Nate's legal team had uncovered something, a pattern of hidden shell companies, all pointing back to Langley's personal financial interests. It was risky, but it was leverage. And if Langley wanted to play dirty, Nate was about to show him just how ugly this could get. Nate had learned a long time ago that power wasn't about money. It was about control. And right now, Langley thought he had control. But he was about to find out what it felt like when the ground started shifting under his feet. A meeting on neutral ground. Nate didn't wait for the next attack. He set the meeting himself. A private room in an upscale restaurant in Midtown Manhattan, dim lighting, low music, the kind of place where powerful men settled their disputes quietly. Langley arrived exactly on time, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his expression unreadable. He sat across from Nate, swirling the whiskey that had already been poured for him. You've been busy, Langley said, his voice calm but edged with something sharper. Nate leaned back, matching his gaze. I have. Langley sighed, taking a slow sip. I gave you a chance to walk away, Holloway. I don't make that offer twice. Nate exhaled, shaking his head. See, that's where you miscalculated. You thought I was some rookie trying to prove myself. But I'm not playing to prove anything. I'm playing to win. Langley chuckled, setting his glass down. And you think you have the leverage to do that? Nate slid a folder across the table. I know I do. Langley opened it, his expression remaining neutral as he scanned the contents. A detailed breakdown of every hidden shell company, every suspicious transaction, every property deal that could tie him to financial misconduct. A slow, heavy silence filled the room. Finally, Langley looked up, his smirk gone. You're bluffing. Nate didn't blink. Try me. Langley's jaw tightened, but he masked it quickly. What do you want? Simple, Nate said smoothly. You drop the SEC review, and you stay the hell out of my way. Langley exhaled, rubbing his temple as if considering his options. But Nate knew better. Men like Langley didn't back down unless they knew they had lost. And this was checkmate. After a long moment, Langley leaned back, his smirk returning. But this time, it was forced. All right, Holloway, you win this round. Nate stood, buttoning his jacket. No, Langley, I win, period. The fall begins. By the next morning, the SEC review into Nate was quietly dismissed. No further action, no further questions. But the real story? The cracks in Langley's empire were starting to show. Reginald Whitmore had thought Langley was his savior, but now he was realizing that Nate might be the only man who had seen the game for what it really was. And that terrified him, because the moment you realized the king wasn't untouchable, it was only a matter of time before the whole damn board collapsed. Nate had won the battle, but the war wasn't over. Not yet. Langley had backed down, but that didn't mean the Whitmores would, especially Reginald. The man had built his entire life around control, and Nate had just ripped it out of his hands. An unexpected call. Late that evening, as Nate reviewed the latest financial reports on Langley's crumbling empire, his phone buzzed. Lauren. He hesitated before picking up. Nate. Her voice was tight, urgent. My father wants to meet with you. Nate raised an eyebrow. I doubt it's for dinner and drinks. Lauren let out a shaky breath. He's different. Ever since Langley pulled back, he's been furious. He won't say it, but I think he's afraid. He's losing everything. Nate leaned back in his chair, letting her words sink in. So Reginald was finally feeling the pressure. Good. What's he offering? Nate asked. He won't tell me. He just said it's something you'll want to hear. Nate smirked. Sounds like a man negotiating from a losing position. Lauren hesitated. Just be careful, Nate. I don't trust him. The last move. The next day, Nate arrived at Reginald Whitmore's private office, a lavish space overlooking the city skyline. It felt like the kind of place built to intimidate. Reginald stood by the window, a glass of scotch in hand. He didn't turn around when Nate entered. "You played a good game," Reginald said finally, his voice calm. "Better than I expected." Nate remained silent, waiting. Reginald turned, his sharp blue eyes locking onto Nate. "But you've made a mistake." Nate smirked. "Enlighten me." Reginald took a slow sip of his drink before setting it down. "Langley was a necessary evil. He gave us power, and in return we played by his rules. But now, you've left me with no choice." Nate frowned slightly. "No choice for what?" Reginald sighed, shaking his head. "To do what I should have done from the start." Then he slid a folder across the desk. Nate opened it, and his blood ran cold. Inside were documents, photos, financial records, a fabricated case, carefully designed to frame him for financial misconduct. "If you think Langley was ruthless, you have no idea what I'm capable of," Reginald said, his voice quiet but laced with steel. Nate's jaw clenched. "This won't hold up." Reginald smiled. "It doesn't have to. It just has to create doubt." Nate closed the folder and met Reginald's gaze, his voice deadly calm. "You're making a mistake." Reginald leaned forward. "No, son, you did. A choice to make." As Nate walked out of that office, his mind was already moving. Reginald thought he had outplayed him, but what the old man didn't realize, Nate Holloway never walked into a fight without an escape plan. And this time, he was going to burn the Whitmores to the ground. Nate had always believed that control wasn't something given, it was something taken. And now it was time to take everything Reginald Whitmore had left. The final betrayal unfolds. The next morning, Nate sat across from Elliot in a quiet corner of a high-end cafe in Manhattan. His friend studied the folder Reginald had handed him the night before, flipping through the fabricated evidence with a grim expression. "They really went all out," Elliot muttered. "Shell companies, altered transaction histories. It's clean, but not clean enough." Nate tapped his fingers against the table. "I don't need to prove it's fake. I just need to prove that Reginald is behind it." Elliot smirked. "That I can do." He slid his laptop forward. "Reginald isn't as untouchable as he thinks. I got into his company's internal communications. Turns out the man is just as sloppy as his son." On the screen, a series of emails between Reginald and a private investigator scrolled past. Discussions about falsifying financial records, backdating transactions, and framing Nate for insider trading. Nate exhaled slowly. "This is it," Elliot grinned. "You ready to drop the hammer?" Nate leaned back, his smirk cold. "I'm about to take everything from him." Destroying a legacy. That evening, Reginald Whitmore was attending a high-profile industry gala. A room full of men just like him, powerful, untouchable, convinced they ruled the world. Nate waited until the moment was right. Then he made his move. A notification pinged on Reginald's phone, and then another, and another. The first news article hit the wire. Reginald Whitmore accused of financial manipulation, SEC investigation pending. The second article followed. Leaked emails reveal Whitmore's scheme to frame competitor, a desperate attempt to maintain power. Around the room, heads turned. Conversation stopped. Reginald's name was now synonymous with scandal. Nate stood in the corner of the room watching as the man who had tried to destroy him crumbled in real time. Reginald's face went pale as his phone buzzed relentlessly. Calls, emails, messages from investors. His world was falling apart. And when he finally spotted Nate across the room, realization dawned in his eyes. He had lost. The last conversation. Reginald stormed toward Nate, his usual composure shattered. "You think this is over?" His voice was low but furious. Nate tilted his head slightly. "No, Reginald, this is just the beginning. Your empire is gone. Your reputation, ruined. And now," he smiled, "you get to see what it feels like to lose everything." Reginald's jaw tightened, his fists clenched, but there was nothing left for him to say, because Nate had already won. The beginning of something bigger. As Nate walked out of the gala, his phone buzzed. It was Lauren. He let it ring. There was nothing left for him in the world of the Whitmores. They had tried to break him. Instead, he had broken them. And now, it was time to build something new. Nate had seen men fall before, executives, politicians, investors who thought they were invincible. But watching Reginald Whitmore's empire collapse in real time, that was something else entirely. The empire crumbles. By morning, every major financial news outlet was covering the scandal. Reginald Whitmore resigns amid SEC investigation. Whitmore real estate stocks plummet as fraud allegations surface. Insider leaks confirm attempt to frame rival for financial crimes. The Whitmores had spent decades crafting an image of wealth and influence. Now they were toxic. Carter tried to do damage control, but it was too late. Investors were fleeing. Business partners were pulling out. And Reginald? He had gone completely silent. Elliot called, his voice full of amusement. Man, I don't think I've ever seen a takedown this clean. Nate exhaled, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. It's not about making it clean. It's about making it permanent. Elliot whistled. Well, mission accomplished. Whitmore Real Estate is dead in the water. Langley isn't touching them either. He's too busy trying to salvage his own mess. Nate allowed himself a small smirk. Reginald had thought Langley would save him. Instead, Langley had cut ties the second things got messy. Loyalty didn't exist in their world, only power. And right now, Nate was the one holding it. The last goodbye. That evening, Nate received one final call. Lauren. He let it ring twice before answering. Lauren. She sounded exhausted. She hesitated. You really did it, didn't you? He didn't respond right away. My father is ruined, she continued. Carter is probably going to get charged with obstruction. My mother, she won't even leave the house. Nate exhaled. They did it to themselves. Silence stretched between them. Then softly she asked, was I ever just part of the plan? That made him pause. No, he said finally, but you made your choice, Lauren. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She just whispered, goodbye, Nate. And just like that, the last tie to the Whitmores was severed. A new chapter. The next morning, Nate stood on the balcony of his penthouse watching the city below. Everything had changed. He wasn't just the pilot they had underestimated. He was the man who had outplayed them all, and now, it was time to decide what came next. For the first time in months, Nate felt something unfamiliar. Clarity. The war with the Whitmores was over. He had won. Reginald's empire was in ruins. Carter was facing legal trouble, and Langley had abandoned them like a sinking ship. The world they had built, the power they had hoarded for generations, it was gone. And yet, as Nate stood on the balcony of his penthouse, looking out over Manhattan, he knew this wasn't the end of the story. The next move. Elliot met him for breakfast at a quiet spot in the West Village, a place they used to go back when they were both broke and dreaming of something bigger. You know, Elliot said between sips of coffee, you could just take a win for once. Kick back. Enjoy the view from the top. Nate chuckled. Since when have I ever been the kickback type? Elliot smirked. Fair point. So what's next? Nate leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. The system isn't broken, it's rigged. People like Langley and Reginald, they don't play fair, but they make the rules. That's why they never see it coming when someone like me changes the game. Elliot raised an eyebrow. So you're not done? I'm just getting started. Because Nate wasn't interested in just tearing down corrupt men. He wanted to build something better. A meeting with an old enemy. That afternoon, Nate made an unexpected stop. Whitmore Real Estate's former headquarters. The building was quiet, most of the executives already gone, their careers burned by the scandal. But Reginald Whitmore was still there, sitting in the office where he had once ruled over a financial empire. The man looked older, more tired than before. His usual arrogance had been stripped away, leaving behind nothing but quiet bitterness. You've got nerve showing up here, Reginald muttered. Nate took a seat across from him. I figured you'd want to know what happens next. Reginald scoffed. You won. What more do you want? Nate's expression didn't change. I don't just want to win. I want to make sure men like you never get the chance to rig the system again. Reginald's lips pressed into a thin line. And how do you plan on doing that? Nate leaned in slightly. By taking everything you built and making it mine. Reginald stared at him, something dark flashing in his eyes. You think you can just replace me? No, Nate said, standing. I think I can do better. And with that, he walked away, leaving Reginald Whitmore to sit in the ruins of his own legacy. The beginning of something bigger. That night, Nate stood once more on his balcony, the city stretching endlessly before him. Lauren was gone. The Whitmores were finished. Langley had backed off. And yet this didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the start of something much, much bigger. Because power wasn't just about money or influence. It was about what you did with it. And now, Nate Holloway had more power than ever. Final line, they wanted me to disappear. Instead, I became the one thing they never saw coming. Power isn't inherited, it's earned. Nate Holloway wasn't just fighting for himself. He was proving that the system doesn't belong to those born into it, but to those bold enough to challenge it. The Whitmores and Langley believed they could control the rules, but they never expected a man like Nate to rewrite them. So what do you think? Was Nate's revenge justified, or did he go too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you love stories about power, betrayal, and redemption, don't forget to subscribe for more. Because sometimes the underdog doesn't just win, he changes the game forever. Double asterisk.